Morning to everyone. I, Dr. Ashutosh Singh. I was instructed to chair this session, this technical session. And in this session, we have 4 paper presenters. First one is Dr. Rajoli Prabhakar. Second one is Godoli Goswami. Third one is Kasturi Sinha. And fourth one is Elizabeth Bizu. All are present?
Yes, sir. I am Godoli Goswami. I am present.
Okay.
Present.
So all the paper, thank you. All the paper presenters will get 10 to 12 minutes for your presentation. And after presentation, if anyone wants to ask any questions and they want to give any suggestion, they all are welcome. Okay, shall we start with Dr. Rajoli Prabhakar, sir?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Sir,
Okay, please proceed, sir.
Actually, Dr. Rajoli Prabhakar, Associate Professor and Head of the Department of English, Kronsnompur University, Nellore. He is not available, sir. My name is Rajkumar, and I present paper on his behalf, sir, because he is otherwise busy in conducting, making arrangements for the convocation to be held on 24th of this month, sir. So I proceed, sir. If you permit, I'll proceed.
Okay, please.
Sir, the paper is on metaphysical traces in the poetry of Richard Wilbur, and I'm going to present the paper, sir. Richard Wilbur is a distinguished American poet, teacher, and editor during the World War II. He is a committed poet who tries to restore form to American poetry. His poetry took shape from his experience in southern France and Italy, where he first started to write to impose order on a world where disorder prevailed. Wilbur's poetry is considered to be a perfect bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds. Wilbur's poetry does not portray the partial truths but lays stress on what is real, true, and hopeful. The imagery in his metaphysical poetry is powerful, drawing from scholastic philosophy, science of his times, and common things of every day. As a revolt against the Elizabethan poet's smooth sweetness, his poetry, with his perplexing allusiveness and his mock of metaphysics, made him a distinguished metaphysical poet. A brief note on metaphysical poetry here would be relevant and appropriate, as Wilbur's poetry is attributed to have traces of metaphysical poetry. The term metaphysical poetry is referred to the poetry of early 17th century poets for their intellectual analysis. John Donne is considered as the father of metaphysical poetry for his complexity and compressed meaning in his poetry. Firstly, the metaphysical poetry is concise, precise, concentrated, and epigrammatic. Secondly, there is the fondness for long conceits with irregular and ingenious comparisons that are complex. They are also famed for their clear-cut arguments, persuasion, and use of conceits. Thirdly, the metaphysical poems are devoid of smooth and regular meter. The syntax is often unusual, and the unconventional imagery drawn from various branches of knowledge. Further, the poems are opened brilliantly with abrupt beginning. There is perfect blend of emotion and intellect, with perfect coherence between intuition, feeling, and intellect, with emotionalized thought and expression. In addition to originality in vocabulary and with appropriate diction to verse, metaphysical poems are natural in style. And the poems of Richard Wilbur bear the traces of the metaphysical poetry as mentioned above. It is to be noted that Wilbur's imagination moves upward through the order of nature, moving towards the invisible through the visible. Wilbur does not deny the visible world like Edgar Allan Poe, who destroyed the visible world on thinking that if one does so, then the invisible world rushes in to take the place of the visible world. To put it in another way, Wilbur has given priority for physical things to inject metaphysical strains in his poetry. Donald Hill, one of the critics of Wilbur, comments on his first collection of poems entitled The Beautiful Changes, published in the year 1947, in the following way. I quote Hill: Poetry of ideas, moderately learned and allusive, strict in its logic as in its phrasing, given to weighing alternative attitudes, fond of arguments and of their consequences. I unquote. Further, Donald Hill opines that Wilbur always, I quote, begins by describing a scene or an object and concludes by making a moral, epistemological, or metaphysical point about it. I unquote. Hill continues his observation that Wilbur resembles Donne in his delight in clever turns of logic and in his love for paradox. The major theme in Wilbur's work reflects the central theme in Western metaphysics: between the ideal and the real, between the being and becoming. The poem, A Black Birch in Winter, written by Richard Wilbur, is a perfect example of metaphysical composition. The poem contains the metaphysical truth, continuum of birth in death and death in birth. The poem is metaphysical in spirit. The poem goes like this. I read the poem. You might not know this old tree and its bark, which once was straight, smooth, glossy dark. So deep now are the rifts which separate its roughened surface into flake and plate. Old trees are doomed to annual rebirth, new wood, new life, new compass, greater girth, and this is all their wisdom and their art to grow, stretch, crack, and not yet come apart. The above lines truly certify the metaphysical view of Wilbur that everything in physical world goes through suffering, change, and decay and death to get new form with new life, which is inevitable. Wilbur deals with a wide variety of topics, metrical forms, and themes in his poetry. He knows the complexity of ideas and attempts in his presentation of topics. A bark wall fountain in Villa Sciarra, which is a minutely descriptive poem, signifies the interest of Wilbur in presenting alternative ideas in life. The poem is contrasting two fountains, the conflict between pleasure and joy. Wilbur presents two ways of life. One is the total rejection of physical world, and the other is embracing the physical world itself. He ends his idea with a conclusion that the ephemeral world is more beautiful and blessed. The poem is popular because of its rhyme and as it contemplates over the claims of actual and ideal more intricately expressed there in the poem. The poem goes like this. In the plain fountains that Madonna set before St. Peter's, the main jet struggling aloft until it seems at rest, in the act of rising until the very wish of water is reversed, that heaviness borne up to burst in a clear, high, cavorting head. In the above lines, Madonna Fountain stands for the Christian virtue of going away from the earth. Fawns represent not the longing for what it is not, but the gratitude for what it is. In this way, his poetry is a solace to the suffered souls and injects faith in hopeless lives that are replete with the bitterness of war. Wilbur has taken his utmost interest in portraying.
Sorry for interruption, sir. Please conclude.
Okay, sir. Okay. Uh, okay, sir. I'll just conclude within 2 minutes. Wilbur has taken his utmost interest in portraying ultimate reality and truth about his mysterious universe through the skill and depiction of familiar things. Wilbur's poetry appears to be the movement from empirical level to the transcendental, Vedantic, and Christian spiritual heights. Finally, to conclude, another poem, that is The Proof, is a remarkable poem by Wilbur for admirable composition and for its metaphysical strains. I just read the poem and conclude, sir. Shall I love God for causing me to be? I was a mere utterance. Shall these words love me? Yet when I caused his work to jar and stammer, one free subject loosed all his grammar. I love him that he did not in a rage, once and forever rule me off the page. Thus, Richard Wilbur reminds the readers of 20th and 21st centuries of the metaphysical poetry by inherently including the traces of metaphysical poetry in his poems. That's the presentation, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for this nice presentation. Anyone, have you any questions? Now the presentation is open for discussion. If you have any question, then please proceed with your questions. Okay, I think no one is interested in asking any questions. So congratulations for your presentation. And now I would like to invite Godali Goswami. Are you present?
Yes, sir.
Yes, please
Hi.
proceed with.
Am
Please
I
proceed
both
with.
visible and audible, sir?
Yes.
Okay, sir. Thank you. So I would like to start by saying good morning to the chairperson, Dr. Ashutosh Singh, and to my fellow paper presenters on this panel, and to everyone tuning in to this very enriching conference at the moment. So my paper is titled Language and Liminality, Exploring Nationalism and Political Linguistics in Ngugi's Decolonizing the Mind. I am Godali Goswami. I am an assistant professor in Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam Government College in Kolkata. And to begin with, I would just like to say that 10 or 12 minutes is obviously a very short time to elucidate on any layered idea. And for that matter, for the purpose of this presentation, I have chosen certain excerpts from Ngugi's book, which I hope will raise certain questions and will make people think about the issues that have been debated for long. But obviously, this very short presentation will not be, it wouldn't be an analysis of the entire book because of the shortage of time. So with that, I would just like to say that, the foundational praxis of the 21st century that we find ourselves in, it is basically, described by certain politico-cultural labels like post-colonial and neo-colonial. And we cannot seem to break out of this particular kind of nomenclature. And what we have to remember is that colonialism was not just an instance of subjugation of other people through the means of physical violence, But essentially, colonialism operated on the foundation of a systematic epistemological violence. Our cognitive experience of the world around us, the way we perceive that experience, and the way we negotiate our quotidian life, everything has been irrevocably appropriated by Western value systems. Now, for examples of this, I would just like to give perhaps two instances. One is the concept of the Middle East. Now, we often refer to the area in the map as Middle East. That is how we find it being referred to in newspapers, or when even great debaters talk about issues related to the Middle East. But if we look at it in a very objective manner, we will find out that it is neither the middle nor the east of anything. It is only the middle or the east of something when you look at it from a particular vantage point, which is the West. Otherwise, it is basically Western Asia. So this is one way that we interact with the physical world around us, but its ideology is extremely Western. And another point that I would like to give is that, so that is how space has been constructed by Western value systems. Now, if I come to an example of time, how we perceive time in the 21st century, in fact, throughout the ages, would be how we have started to use Gregorian calendar throughout the world, although every community has its own calendar. So we can see, and I'm from Kolkata, so I will say that in Kolkata, uh, even a few years ago, 24th of August, 1698 was seen as the birth date of the city, all just because Job Charnock, who was an East India Company agent, had set foot. So you see, with the arrival of the British, it was as if the history of our region had started. So both time and space have been defined by Western value systems. We are living in this world right now. So it is high time that we question these value systems, whether there are alternative ways of living. Now, keeping that in mind, we have to say that the colonialist discourse has even rendered our cognitive space malleable to the extent that it can lead to a feeling of disconnect with and alienation from one's own self. I am, of course, referring to the weaponization of language, that propagandist vehicle of imperialism. In this context, I would like to just share a particular quotation that I have found. It is actually from a very old book. The name of the book is Grammatica Castellana, and it was written by Elio Antonio de Nebrija, who was the Bishop of Avila, and it was written in the very momentous year of 1492, which we all know that was the year when the New World was accidentally discovered by Columbus, and it was a start of a different kind of exploitation. So he had written all those years ago, and I quote him, "Language has always been the consort of empire, and forever shall remain its mate. Together they came into being, together they grow and flower." I unquote. So we can understand the centrality of language to the colonial discourse and also to the post-colonial discourse. And we can all unanimously agree that it is the linguistic space that eventually becomes the vortex of all ideological power structures. The ideological control of language ensures the ideological control of entire discourses, be it political, economic, literary, or philosophical. Language then becomes the most potent weapon in the hands of the colonizers for cultural control. Now, when it comes to Ngugi, I have had the very, very good fortune of seeing him live in an interview when he had come down to Kolkata in 2018. And I had even taken his autograph, just as an anecdote, I can just say. Now, he had talked about in that interview how he had decided to forego English as his medium of expression with the book Petals of Blood, which he wrote in 1977, but he continued to write his nonfiction works in English. till 1986 with the publication of Decolonizing the Mind, after which he said that from then on, he would not even use English to write non-fiction works. He would only use Kikuyu. So that was his position. And in that interview, he had said that when asked why did he reject English as his medium of expression, he had said that once I saw the light, I could feel the darkness that I was in. And when a person sees the light, he cannot embrace the darkness. He has to embrace the light. I mean, these are not his exact words. I am obviously paraphrasing him because that interview was 3 years old. But this is what I remember what he said. Now, this is something that I have found not many research papers on decolonizing the mind generally put out. But Ngugi's book, Decolonizing the Mind, is actually based on a particular poem by the Caribbean writer Martin Carter. And this poem is Looking at Your Hands, which was published in October 1951 by Martin Carter. And in this poem, I'm just going to read out a few lines from this poem. Martin Carter says, and I quote from the poem, "No, I will not still my voice. I have too much to claim. If you see me looking at books or coming to your house or walking in the sun, know that I look for fire. I have learned from books, dear friend, of men dreaming and living and hungering in a room without a light, who could not die since death was far too poor, who did not sleep to dream, but dreamed to change the world." This is a part of the poem, and Ngugi writes, I have Decolonizing the Mind, the book with me. Ngugi writes in the introduction to his book that, and I quote him from the book, "The theme of this book is simple. It is taken from a poem by the Guyanese poet Martin Carter, in which he sees ordinary men and women hungering and living in rooms without lights. All those men and women in South Africa, Namibia, Kenya, Zaire, Ivory Coast, El Salvador, Chile, Philippines, South Korea, Indonesia, Grenada, Panos wretched of the earth, who have declared loud and clear that they do not sleep to dream, but dream to change the world." So this is the very foundational basis of Ngugi's book. And then in the very first chapter, Ngugi talks about the momentous occasion when he was invited to a conference of African writers of English expression at the Makerere College in 1962 in Kampala, Uganda. And there, I would just like to quote what Ngugi said in the year 1962 about this conference, which was basically a gathering of African writers writing in English and other European languages like French and Portuguese, which were kind of the lingua franca of post-colonial African societies. And Ngugi had written in 1962 itself, just after this conference, and I quote him, "I wanted to meet Chinua Achebe, the young Nigerian novelist whose 2 novels, Things Fall Apart and No Longer at Ease, seemed to herald the birth of a new society in which writers freed from the burden of political protests at a disintegrating colonialism can cast an unsentimental eye at human relationships." So this was Ngugi's primary reaction. But when we come back 26 years later in 1986, in this book, which was Decolonizing the Mind, published in 1986, in this book, Ngugi is completely different in his reaction. After 26 years, in hindsight, Ngugi says that the title, A Conference of African Writers of English Expression, and I quote him, automatically excluded those who wrote in African languages. Now, on looking back from the self-questioning heights of 1986, I can see this contained absurd anomalies. And he says that he was just a student back in 1962 who had just written 2 short stories, The Fig Tree and The Return, but both were in English. And he says that just because he had written those short stories in English, he was given an invitation to the conference, whereas There were certain great African writers like Shaban Robert, who was an East African poet, then Chief Fagunwa, who was a Nigerian writer. These were writers who had a prolific
Sorry for
work.
interruption, Kajoli. Please
Okay.
conclude within a
Yes,
minute.
sir. So I would conclude within a minute. So as he said that these were writers who had a great body of literary work already behind them, but they were not given any invitation to this conference just because they did not write in English or any other European language. And then Chinua Achebe had also talked about this in his uh, book Politics and Politicians of Language in African Literature, who actually kind of criticizes Ngugi himself and what Ngugi had written in Decolonizing the Mind. And he says that Chinua Achebe, as in his rebuttal to Ngugi, says that I write in English. English is a world language, but I do not write in English because it is a world language. My romance with the world is subsidiary to my involvement with Nigeria and Africa. And this is what Chinua Achebe writes. Actually, I have so much to say, but I obviously could not say much. So in conclusion, I would just like to say one thing, that Ngugi talks about the harmony that a child nurtures between the environment and the language that he or she speaks. And when that language, the mother tongue, is ripped away from him and a foreign language is imposed by an external force to facilitate the colonialist society, then it creates a certain disharmony, and it is this rupture, this kind of disconnect from one's own self when it comes to the linguistic basis that Ngugi explores in this book. Obviously, there are lots of points to talk about, but I would just like to end with one poem, just 3 lines of one poem, which talks about this abrogation of language. It is by Lorna Goodison, and the name of the poem is Turn Dance to Miss Miri. And in this poem named Abrogation, she says, she could not read or write a word in English, but took every vowel and consonant of it and wrung it around like the articulated neck of our Sunday dinner sacrificial fowl. In her anger, she stabbed at English, walked it out, abandoned it in favor of a long kissed teeth. Thank you. That is my presentation.
Thank you, Godali Goswami ma'am. Any questions from participant side? No. Okay, now I would like to invite our next participant, who is Kasturi Sinha. Are you present? Kasturi Sinha? Kasturi Sinha from Remensa University, Cuttack. Okay. Next paper presenter is Elizabeth Bizu. Are you present?
Yes, I am present. Can I start, sir?
Yes, please proceed.
Yeah. So good morning, all. My paper presentation is titled as Fables to Screen. Actually, for this paper, my broader area is actually
Sorry
children's.
for interruption. Elizabeth ma'am, please first introduce yourself.
Okay,
It's
sorry,
about
sir.
your affiliation from which college.
Okay, okay. I'm Elizabeth Biju from Chennai, assistant professor working in Ethraj College for Women. Okay. So my paper presentation is titled as Fables to Screen, whereas my broader area is actually children's literature and how children's literature caters to the young readers, and not only just young readers, but also the adult readers. And my narrowed down narrowed down paper presentation is actually Fables to Screen, for wherein I have taken a special focus on C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. So how I have, I'll just explain how I have traced down my paper for this presentation. So as I told you, my broader area of paper is children's literature. So I've just started out with how this, like the idea of children's literature actually started off. Like earlier, like when, tracing back, children's literature itself, like the genre did not exist as such. It all started with fables or the oral tradition, we all know the oral tradition. So it all started with oral tradition. And earlier we did not have this genre called children's literature, but later on during the Victorian age, when people thought, there should be a genre for children, that's when importance was given to this children's literature. And that's when late Victorian era, the children's literature all started. So I have actually gone down to trace the beginnings of children's literature from oral tradition, and how later on we have a proper genre called children's literature. And I have actually taken C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, because he is he is a famous name in children's literature. Now, talking about children's literature and C.S. Lewis, okay, I have narrowed down my paper to with a special focus on C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, and especially the first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So here we all know Narnia is a magical land, and how C.S. Lewis actually creates a magic with this magical land. So the theory, there are so many theories which can actually be intertwined with this paper. But then what I found very apt was the theory of magic realism. How C.S. Lewis, blends lot of magic and realism into the work. And I found magic realism was very apt to be brought into this area. Now, fables to digitalization. So, like today, in an era of science and technology, everything is. Like we know, and especially after the COVID and all that, we know the importance of technology, and how everything has become a blended learning, and how like technology plays an important role and all that. But when we trace back, it all began from the oral tradition, folk tales, fables, to mention our own Panchatantra, Jataka tales, and many more. We have the Grimm's fairy tales and all that, and how they all play an important role, because these folk tales, fables, and all that, they are very important to trace our roots back. So they're very important. And when we look back to the folk tales, fables, and all that, they all have morals to tell. And when we employ these folk tales and fables, they also have so many themes and symbols and all that. So also in this Chronicles of Narnia, when we look at the novel, there are a lot of themes and symbols, especially when we need to cater this to the children or the young readers. There are so many themes employed to cater to them. There are a lot of symbols actually, through this novel, especially the first one. You see a lot of instruction happening for the children, lot of instruction, and there's a lot of interaction, and finally there's also this delight element. So I think any work of children's literature should be a combination of all these three: instruction, interaction, and delight, and that we actually see in Chronicles of Narnia. So, like when we look back at folk tales, fables, and all that, all these elements were actually there. You had the element of instruction, you had the element of interaction, and you also did have the element of delight. So only then it serves the purpose actually. Then here when so as I told you, like my narrow area is fables to digitalization. How from fables, now today it has become a digitalized world, and how everything is digitalized. So like when I narrow down my paper to fables to digitalization or fables to screen, like I have divided my paper into like a first part is like technical elements in the movie and Chronicles of Narnia, and then similar I have traced down the similarities and dissimilarities between the book and the movie, and then reception of the book and its movie version. This is how I have actually divided my paper when I talk about fables to screen. um, the technical elements in the movie is like, the screenplay of the movie reveal many mysterious plots and secrets and carries within it many twists, as the movie had to project more than 60 unique characters in the final battle. The structure of creatures and their costumes were very well executed, that offers a delightful visual treat to the audience. For instance, the costume of the White Witch looked grandiose as she wore a big white coat with the snowy flakes spilling all over, and the sledge used by her had been designed spectacularly, that represents that she is indeed a snowy ice woman. The soundtrack of the movie was excellent, as it was able to convey the emotions of the scene like fear, joy, pride, jealousy, sorrow, and happiness, thereby making the audience empathize with the feelings of the characters. The movie had its own faults. Um, Even the first visit to Narnia by Lucy, which was supposed to be a delightful and magical moment, loses its flavor compared to the interesting visits of the other Pevensies. The clash between the different creatures in Narnia, one of the highlighting scenes in the movie, appeared to be too long and nearly inserted to prolong the duration of the movie instead of providing an interesting twist to the story. Yet the movie grabbed the attention of the audience through a few strong and influential scenes like Aslan's entry, as Aslan is an important character in the movie, and Aslan is actually the representation of Jesus as per Christian beliefs, and the White Witch was obviously compared to Satan, which had been portrayed remarkably in the movie. The child artist of the movie had been given a tremendously awesome performance. More than the cinematography and the visual effects, and the animation team had done fabulous work in projecting the lively experience of Narnia and other creatures like lion, werewolves, beavers, etc. uh, Now, like initially the book The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe did not receive a favorable attention. It formed a part of children's literature which did not sit well with the adult readers. But slowly the scenario underwent a favorable change when a second book, Prince Caspian, a sequel to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, hit the stands. It received a lot of positive reviews because its prequel had by then become the most sought after children's book in the market, and the author had earned a prominent place in the annals of children's literature. The complete audio track of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was released in 2000 during its 50th anniversary and received a positive review in Publishers Weekly of November 20th of 2000. Because of the reputation gained by The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the reviewers had started focusing on the work done by the British actor Michael York, which they called an enchanting and nimble performance, and that its unflagging sense of excitement and wonder has captivated a wide range of listeners. The movie, The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe received both positive and negative feedback among the audience, especially the children and the young adults. The essential theme of the story was about religious belief, and faith and religious perspective was a factor that remains in the minds of the audience. The series of books and movies, which were based on Narnia, followed the principles and the beliefs of Christianity. Thus, it was considered as a like there were a lot of mixed reviews for the movie. Anyways, Narnia also obtained responses from non-Christians like Philip Pullman, who was a successful fantasy novelist famous for one of his fantasy trilogies, his Dark Materials. He considered himself an atheist. Secularism and humanism were the most important factors that he strongly believed and admired. He had a strong disregard for the Narnia series. Even though the Narnia series had many critics from popular Christian authors, several non Christian authors and literary critics and the neo pagans had the book in their reading list. After some years, Chronicles and its authors were criticized largely by the authors of fantasy fiction, especially for the stereotypical gender roles. The best example for this scenario would be when Peter gets a sword while Lucy gets a dagger and a healing liquid. Majority of claims about sexism opens up when Lewis, while describing Susan Pevensive in a chapter in The Last Battle, wrote a line, "The Zoner, a friend of the Narnian world, as she is busy with her invitations, lipsticks, and nylons." On the contrary, Philip Pullman stated that Narnian stories disparage women greatly. He has given his own interpretation of Susan's character when he compares the character of Susan with Cinderella, where she goes into her transition state from one phase into another, but Lewis never approved of this in any of the books. In general, Lewis was criticized that he disliked women or sexuality, which was reflected in the series of Narnia books. It was also argued that Lewis does not like the concept of growing up. This is how I have concentrated on fables to screen, and then later on I've later on I've given the scope for research. That is you can actually intertwine you can bring in eco criticism, green studies, trauma studies, and because this is a wider area where you can intertwine a lot of theories, so there's a lot of scope for research. When you bring in this, actually that's how I have concluded my paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth ma'am. Any questions from participant side? No. Okay, Elizabeth ma'am, I have a question. May I ask?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. What do you think that when you are, as you have just talked about fables to screen,
Yes, sir.
so whether it is very difficult for the writer to just take the reader to that particular level of imagination, or just to critically think about the message was that is present in that fable, or it is very difficult for the means the director who is just presenting that particular piece of work on the screen, whose task seems to be very difficult according.
Actually, the writer's task is very difficult, sir, because your writing has to be really competent to make the reader visualize, be in that place and visualize. Whereas for a director, it's very easy because you have lot of technological help now. Whatever you want to bring it on the screen, you can actually do it with the help of technology. So the writer's role is very difficult to make the reader visualize and be in that place, sir.
Okay. Do you think that when any writer or means the director is directing that particular story or presenting it on the screen, are they losing few things, or they are just when they are just presenting it on the screen, sometimes we have just seen that they have just lost the main content of the story?
Yes, sir. Sometimes talking in general, sometimes minute details are missed out. That is like when they do bring in lot of technological things on the screen. Some details, very minute details, important details are actually lost. So actually, when there's an adaptation, we don't see the exact adaptation happening. Like the main storyline is there, but then many a times lot of minute important details are actually lost on the screen, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. In this technical, I am just concluding. Kasturi Sinha, are you present? No. Thank you to all the three participants who have just presented their paper, and all the papers are very good. And yes, anyone saying? So, first paper that was presented on the poetry of the Wilbur. The second one that was just presented by Goduli Sinha, that was also very good, and that is on Ngugi, and she had just talked about the post-colonial approach towards the language, and later on Elizabeth has just presented her paper on fables to screen. Congratulations to all the three participants, and